Last week, we began the conversation about creator Joel Hodgson's final episode of MST3K, Experiment 512, Mitchell. We took a detour to discuss the role that made Mitchell himself, Joe Don Baker, somewhat of a star, and touched upon the various sequels and reboots that were made for some reason. Today, we conclude the chapter with a discussion of the episode itself, as well as some important and not so important influences. I'm Ryan Rodriguez. Welcome to the mid-season finale of Season 1 of The Coolness Chronicles, the history and legacy of MST3K. Chapter 7, A Box of Hamdingers, concluded. Before I go any further, if you don't already own the DVD of this episode, please go to rifftracks.com and buy the digital version. It's only $10 and comes with an intro from Mike Nelson, and from what I've learned, all MST3K episodes purchased from the RiffTrax website actually lead to compensation for the people responsible for the show, something that previous home video licensing deals were sorely lacking in. It's available for streaming on a certain service, but because they don't get squat if you watch it there, I'm not going to mention it. In a special featurette on the Mitchell DVD, Trace, Kevin, and Joel discuss the various creative choices made during what's now known as the last flight of Joel Robinson, and as it turns out, most of the magic was happenstance. They didn't save Mitchell for this episode. It just naturally came at the right time and was off concept just enough to work perfectly. As we addressed in the very first chapter of this podcast, the original basic concept of MST3K stuck primarily to low-rent sci-fi, poverty row horror, and schlocky monster movies. This expanded with the riffing of teen-sploitation movies like Untamed Youth, the sub-Easy Rider biker genre, sword and sandal fantasy, fad-of-the-moment drive-in double-feature fare like Daddy-O, and even dubbed foreign folk tales. But Mitchell was the first cop movie, and whether you like it or not, and as some of my friends have informed me, plenty don't, usually when the series ventures outside of its comfort zone, the results are quite spectacular, at least in my eyes, with such gems as Radar Secret Service, The Starfighters, Angel's Revenge, and naturally, Final Justice. But if any of these episodes are not your cup of tea, I apologize ahead of time for some future chapters of this season. In order to keep the momentum of the show going and not lose a reactionary chunk of the fan base, the Mitchell episode needed to be important, but not so important that they couldn't recover from it. Consequently, I would argue that the episode results in some of the most astute, layered, and downright gut-busting riffs of the entire series, all pitched with a speed and delivery that shows just how far the show had come from its humble roots. Not to mention a nice progression in the visual aesthetic and ambition of the show, which would dramatically increase in the years to come. Hell, they even made a movie. Granted, it was an awful experience, but it was in theaters and stuff. For the second and, well, obviously last time, a Joel episode would have a running storyline. But unlike Fire Maidens from Outer Space and Crow's Dark Spectre doppelganger Timmy, the story actually encapsulates the entire episode this time. Also, unlike Fire Maidens from Outer Space, no Fire Maidens are involved in the episode in any fashion. Outer Space is, however, featured quite prominently. Kind of unavoidable considering the setting of the series. The story kicks off with Forrester and Frank being audited by the Fraternal Order of Mad Science, and since they don't want to do any of the legwork themselves... They hired a temp by the name of Mike. Oh no, I am so sorry. I do not know what that was or how that happened. That was just a momentary hiccup. But as I alluded to earlier, this episode features the first appearance of Michael J. Nelson as Mike Nelson, an amiable temp from Wisconsin and not-too-distant future host of the show. And by not-too-distant future, I mean the next episode, next Sunday AD. The smartest decision in Mike's introduction was that he's weaved throughout the episode, interacting with and observing the Satellite of Love for the first time and laying the groundwork for future character evolution without overshadowing the simple fact that the whole fabric of the show's reality is about to be seriously altered and without lessening the impact of Mike's first official experiment. And as a former temp myself, shocking I know, I instantly can sympathize with Mike's predicament. One job I held for about 6 months involved me looking through boxes of people's expunged medical records from 5 p.m. to midnight and counting the pages. Every movement and break and breath was watched over by a gruff supervisor, and every room had a keycard sensor. You would think I worked for Blofeld. I would rather go through deadly invention exchanges for days than do that shit again. Anyway, after Mike finishes his inventory of almost every previous existing invention exchange, Forrester and Frank have made some dire plans.
Don't worry, Doctor. I knew when we brought him on we'd have to eliminate him. That's half the fun.
Yes, Frank, but how? These things must be done delicately.
After all, he knew going in that this was only a temporary situation.
Yes, and now I want this temporary situation taken care of permanently.
Are we talking about the same thing?
He's been a canker sore on my gum line for too long.
The way he struts around like he owns the place.
Pa! Let's use method number 53, hmm?
Yes, elegant, painful.
And leaves nothing behind but the great smell of brute. Let's do it now. No, patience, my little henchman. Let's wait until after the experiment.
Yes, brilliant. Make him work for it. Yeah.
And then our little bejumpsuited fool will be history.
But why would they do such a thing? Well...
What do you want from us? We're evil! Evil!
Here's the upside/downside. Gypsy is accidentally patched through to Deep 13 and witnesses this conversation. Her natural mothering tendencies activated, she mistakes the murder plot victim for Joel and spends the rest of the episode trying to find a way to get him off the satellite before the end of the experiment, with no help from the other bots and without letting Joel know that his demise is presumed to be imminent. This leads to several homages to some of the more influential films to the MST3K gang, namely Dr. Strangelove and most prominently 2001: A Space Odyssey, which also contributes a large amount to Traceable U's final episode 2 seasons later. Thankfully, Gypsy manages to contact Mike in Deep 13 and a plan is set in motion.
Here's a manifest for the Satellite of Love. Maybe there's something here that can help.
Yes, please.
Okay, I assume you tried to gain control of the escape pod in Dock 14.
Yes, I tried to gain control. There's an escape pod in Dock 14?
According to this, there's a single occupant escape pod called the Deus Ex Machina.
How could I not see it? Stupid dumb!
I wouldn't blame yourself, Gypsy. Apparently it's in a box marked Hamdingers.
Well, no wonder we didn't see it. Nobody likes Hamdingers.
Thanks to Frank's love of keys, something that apparently runs in the family, again, I'm getting way ahead of myself, Mike logs into the MAD's computer and gets Gypsy access to the satellite's functions. Once the experiment is concluded, and before Joel has time to read his final letter from the audience, he's expelled into Dock 14 of the SOL. Cambot switches to rocket number 9, and the bots watch as Gypsy initiates the end of an era.
Hey, look! There's a prize inside that box of Hamdingers. An escape pod.
Hey guys, look at me, I'm on my way to Earth. Pretty crazy, huh?
When the tiny model of the escape pod launches, there are actually a pair of tiny hands that serve as the base of the launch bay, making the name of the pod incredibly apt and surprisingly literal. Since Gypsy launches the Deus Ex Machina, does that make her God? Something to think about. Or not. An embarrassing admission, I had seen this episode in its entirety 49 times before researching this episode, and never noticed the hands. I'm a moron. In a rather tender, almost final moment, Joel Robinson leaves his robot children with a plaque, inscribed with a quote from his favorite movie, George Pal's The Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe.
To all on the Satellite of Love from Joel.
Hey, that's us. Shh.
The whole world is a circus if you look at it the right way. Every time you pick up a handful of dust and see not the dust, but a mystery, a marvel there in your hand. Every time you stop and think, I'm alive, and being alive is fantastic. Every time such a thing happens, you are part of the circus of Dr. Lou.
What? Circus of Dr. Lou? Oh, gee, brother. Joel leaves, and his last words are from a George Pal's movie? Oh, I thought it would be something profound, like from the Psalms or the Upanishads, or even the Desiderata, for that matter.
Now, I don't mean to be one of those guys, but earlier in Season 3, in Master Ninja 1 to be precise, Joel lists his favorite movie as Colossus the Forbin Project. He also decides to let his final official words, until his awkward cameo in Season 10's Soul Taker,
See you later. Sorry, folks, I can't come back. I don't know how it works. Goodbye.
Wow.
serve as a reference perhaps to the most quoted film in MST3K history, The Wizard of Oz. I don't think a single episode was produced in the original run of the show that didn't call back to Oz in some fashion. Now, and I'm not proud to admit this, I've watched a lot of movies in my life. Some could say too many, but I'd never seen any of Joel's fluctuating favorite movies, and I saw The Wizard of Oz one time on broadcast television when I was perhaps 6. And because I'd clearly been using this podcast as a smokescreen to watch a whole bunch of movies that I was either too lazy or ignorant, and wise in a few occasions, to watch before, I decided that this was time to go to Amazon, make a few purchases, and go on my final detour of this, the first half of this road trip. That's right. There might be a gap in programming before this podcast returns. Not long, I promise, unless you dislike the show, in which case I'll lie and placate you by pretending to retire. But before all that unpleasantness, or great pleasantness, depending on your perspective, it's time to talk about 3 movies, 2 of which have a lot in common thematically, and one of which just might be now one of my top 20 favorite films. We'll start in chronological order, and start by taking a trip to 1939, entering a mystical realm known as the MGM Backlot in Hollywoodland, USA. Directed by Victor Fleming and 4 other guys, The Wizard of Oz is a cultural touchstone for America. It's affected so many facets of our society that it would be a waste of time for me to do a plot synopsis. You know what it's about because you've already seen it, and if you haven't seen it, 10 minutes in, you will already know everything that's about to happen because you've soaked it in via osmosis. Hell, the British Film Institute apparently has it on a list of 50 movies you should see before you're 14, which personally sounds like peer pressure to me. According to Wikipedia, the Library of Congress insists that it's, quote, the most seen film in movie history, end quote, which to me just sounds like poorly worded, but certainly does confirm that you, likely an American, aside from maybe a few of my friends in Canada and the UK and Germany, have seen it, or at least know everything about it. But here's the thing, for years, I fucking hated this movie. Like I said before, I first watched it when it was on TV, back when it was an annual tradition on network television, and of all the movies I watched when I was 6, it was the one I was least interested in. I just never cared about it, and the more that culture kept insisting that it was the greatest thing in the world, the more I resisted. Also, it never seemed to make an impact on my parents, or if it did, they certainly never verbalized it, so there wasn't an unspoken household appreciation for it. It's been a clear influence on some of my favorite writers, actors, and directors, but that never seemed to be enough to make me give a shit. It didn't help that the phrase "we're not in Kansas anymore" has been co-opted and run to the ground by lazy screenwriters, see the previous chapter for one in particular named James Cameron, so I started to regard this Wizard of Oz script as terrible. And I was just starting to seriously get into film when the whole Warner Home Video plague of, it's an anniversary, let's put out a new DVD with no new features and the same damn transfer as last year, started to spread. Every time this movie turned another year older, it was like a forced national celebration, and I rejected it. Much in the same way, all of summer of 2017, when every single person in my office at my day job were discussing Game of Thrones spoilers and posting memes on their cubicles, I was silently screaming, "Fuck you, Twin Peaks is the only television!" I avoided The Wizard of Oz like it was a nasty STD. Even when I would visit the dearly departed Great Movie Ride, R.I.P., at the Disney, insert new name here, theme park in Orlando, it would bug me that the most sophisticated animatronic, and pretty much the only one with real articulation, was the Wicked Witch of the West. I would always ask myself, why not animate the xenomorph from Alien or Indiana Jones instead? I was always impressed, but I just wish it was used for a different movie. So when I started getting back into MST3K big time, and I started noticing that nary an episode went by without referencing Oz, it would be the rare annoyance each time. But in many episodes, primarily during the Joel years, I would hear a very familiar riff that never failed to make me chuckle.
I can't stop them. I don't know how it works. Goodbye, folks.
It was always presented in a different context, but usually used when somebody seemed to be interacting with something that was malfunctioning. I didn't know where it was from. It sounded vaguely familiar, but out of my grasp. When I finally put it into a Google search bar after Google was finished asking me if I was a fucking novice, I was astonished to learn its origin. and it was on that fateful day that I went to Amazon and bought the Blu-ray. I was lucky to get a copy because it's clearly not a title that Warner Home Video exploits or floods the marketplace with. Wink, wink. 2 days later, when I received my 3-disc set, which also includes a 3D version of the movie, a development that feels comparable to colorizing Casablanca, I popped it in, expecting to count the runtime until it ran out. But once I wasn't in Kansas anymore, I was absolutely riveted. I loved almost everything about it. I won't lie, I was a little stoned, but it was just fantastic. I did get a little distracted for a few minutes looking for the old urban legend of the Munchkin that hanged himself on the soundstage, and even spent whole minutes just watching the acting range of Toto, which is phenomenal, by the way. But mostly I was rapt and felt like a little kid. I still had the film nerd instincts that helped me see that the camera framing was a little stagey and stiff, but the colors, even though I'm colorblind, and the makeup and sets, however antiquated the Blu-ray mastering have made them, are pure cinema. It was easy to see why David Lynch and the Zucker brothers are obsessed with this movie as they are, which we'll get to much later, and my enjoyment of their work that referenced this film just made me enjoy this film all the much more. But one thing that kept popping up in the back of my brain was Weird World. If you listen to Chapter 2 of this season, you'll remember that I've been working on a spec script for a Marvel movie based on the fictional planet of Weird World and some of the miniseries of the same name for possibly more than half a decade. If you didn't listen to that chapter, let me reiterate something. Kevin Feige, Marvel Studios, if you're out there, give me a call. I work cheap, and we could do something truly special. Come on, what do you have to lose? You made $2 billion on a story about a golden power glove.
I love the power glove. It's so bad.
This would be like printing money! I started noticing subconscious inspirations. A strong young female protagonist, alternate colorful dimension of esoteric wonder, anthropomorphized animal companions, road movie structure, wicked sorceresses, weird tree creatures, lollipop guilds, you name it. All this time, I thought I was channeling the mojo of Labyrinth, but it turns out my brain was stuck in Oz. And by the time I reached the climax of the film, I had completely forgotten why I was watching the movie and just gave in to everything it had to offer. But then the Wizard, played very convincingly by James Franco in his best role since Spring Breakers, gets into his hot air balloon.
Your wizard, Par Ardua ad Alta, am about to embark upon a hazardous and technically unexplainable journey into the outer stratosphere. To confer, converse, and otherwise hobnob with my brother wizards. And I hereby decree that until what time, if any, that I return, the Scarecrow, by virtue of his highly superior brains, shall rule in my stead, assisted by the Tin Man, by virtue of his magnificent heart, and the Lion, by virtue of his courage. Obey them as you would me. Thank you.
Oh, Toto, come back! Toto! Oh, don't go without me. I'll be right with you.
Stop that door! This is a highly irregular procedure. Absolutely unprecedented. Ruin my exit.
Ah! Come back! Don't go without me. Please come back!
I can't come back. I don't know how it works. Goodbye, folks.
And I almost rolled off my bed in absolute hysterics. All I could think of was Joel Hodgson being sprayed with confetti meant to look like video transmission static, and I was helpless. I still don't know why those were Joel's last words, but I don't think he could have chosen better. I was riding so high in The Wizard of Oz that once it was all over, I made the mistake of chasing that cinematic dragon and started to peruse the supplemental features on the disc, and that's what led me to possibly the most infuriating and depressing DVD extra that's ever been created, called We Haven't Really Met Properly. This feature, hosted by Angela Lansbury, is absolutely galling. She'll present an actor from the film and tease a dumb quiz question.
You're a very bad man.
Oh, no, my dear. I'm a very good man. I'm just a very bad wizard.
It's impossible to imagine anyone other than Frank Morgan as the Wizard of Oz, but the part almost went to W.C. Fields.
Prove it.
These two comic geniuses had something else in common, but we'll come to that in just a moment.
You're wasting my time!
Then you have to sit through 2 minutes of the actor's filmography with clips of some of the movies and get the same ending every time.
Saints, they never lie, you know.
On September 18th, 1949, after nearly 20 years as one of Hollywood's most beloved character actors, Frank Morgan passed away at the age of 59.
Poor little kid. I hope she gets home all right.
What did Frank Morgan and W.C. Fields have in common? They both rented the same house, a magnificent Hollywood mansion that was later the home of Lily Tomlin.
Goodbye, folks!
Yes, they make Jessica Fletcher tell us all when every actor died, which is really depressing considering that she's pretty close to the grave herself and had to sit in a recording booth and talk about a bunch of dead people that she may have even worked with, then answer the stupid quiz question, which will never have anything to do with anything important. And this is just the first example. There's like 10 of these. It's basically like an article from Screen Rant in video form. Don't watch them. And don't give in to Screen Rant either. Okay, now that we've covered Joel's last words, let's discuss his last act, namely his favorite movie. Or shall I say, movies. One is far superior to the other, so much so that I'm going to give a severe spoiler warning. If you haven't seen Colossus the Forbin Project yet, pause this podcast and go watch it, then come back. I shouldn't have to add that last part, but I crave validation. I would recommend that you pick up the Shout Factory Blu-ray on Amazon or whatever merchant you frequent, but if you don't trust my judgment, just go watch it in HD on Daily Motion. It's free, but you need to make an account. Just don't watch it on YouTube. Please, for the love of Christ. Okay, still with me? Colossus comes from director Joseph Sargent, who brought us both The Taking of Pelham 123 and Jaws the Revenge, which puts him in director limbo, and screenwriter James Bridges, who wrote The China Syndrome and Perfect, limbo again, based on the first novel in a trilogy by Dennis Feltham Jones that I didn't read because I'm not good with books. The year is 1970. Dr. Charles Forbin, played by the great Eric Braeden, who will in time become an MST3K featured performer, a stoic scientist who designs an artificial intelligence to serve as the sole overseer of America's defense systems. Within minutes of being fully activated, this system, dubbed Colossus, becomes sentient and informs his creator that the Soviets have made their own system, Guardian. Colossus and Guardian begin to communicate, and when the respective US and Russian governments are uncomfortable with this notion, the two systems mutually nuke one target on the other's territory. Soon, Colossus is ruling the nation with an iron fist, demanding more control and issuing death warrants for any insubordinates. Soon, Colossus puts Forbin under surveillance 24/7, so he's forced to hatch a plan with his fellow scientists to swap out the nation's nukes with duds while having his every move and gesture analyzed and punished. Colossus also merges with Guardian and decides to declare war on all countries that are not under its control unless they disarm and surrender, then creates a synthesized voice done by previous chapter subject Paul Frees to establish a greater independence from its programmers. By the end of the film, Colossus has discovered Forbin's ruse and retaliates by detonating missile silos on both continents and has subjugated humankind, promising everlasting peace.
Let this action be a lesson that need not be repeated. I have been forced to destroy thousands of people in order to establish control and to prevent the death of millions later on. Time and events will strengthen my position, and the idea of hearing me and understanding my value will seem the most natural state of affairs. You will come to defend me with a fervor based upon the most enduring trait in man, self-interest. Get out! Under my absolute authority, problems insoluble to you will be solved. Famine, overpopulation, disease. The human millennium will be a fact as I extend myself into more machines devoted to the wider fields of truth and knowledge. Dr. Charles Forbin will supervise the construction of these new and superior machines, solving all the mysteries of the universe for the betterment of man. We can coexist but only on my terms. You will say you lose your freedom. Freedom is an illusion. All you lose is the emotion of pride. To be dominated by me is not as bad for human pride as to be dominated by others of your species.
Colossus is basically the yin to Doctor Strangelove's yang, and I know that sounds like heresy. Strangelove is arguably the better film, but Colossus is the better gut punch. It's brilliantly paced and delivers more legitimate tension in its brief 90 minutes than the entire first season of Breaking Bad. Why this film isn't as well regarded as it should be might be directly related to its bluntness. It doesn't soften the blow. It doesn't let you off the hook as a viewer. It forces you to be Forbin, to watch something you created out of misguided utopian ideals evolve into something unstoppable and unmatched, like giving birth to the cutest baby on the planet only to slowly discover that it's the Antichrist. It's the Omen with supercomputers. Eric Braeden, who had to change his name to make this film, delivers a miracle of a performance, never fully letting the audience into his inner turmoil until there's no inner left. He spends a great deal of the film methodically pacing through sterile, cavernous sets that resemble a more stripped-down Ken Adams style, bristling at the evolution of Colossus, and watching his acting is akin to seeing a good chess match. It's the facial cues that he doesn't use that define how riveting he is. So much so that I would argue he gives one of the great performances certainly of the 1970s, if not of all time. Unfortunately, Mr. Braeden hasn't been used to his full potential since Colossus, though he's been working steadily for decades, having been a regular on The Young and the Restless for 28 years, as well as playing the villain in one of my favorite guilty pleasure time travel films, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, as well as a minor goon in an MST3K Season 6 experiment, codenamed Diamond Head. By going through his filmography, I discovered that he also plays a prominent role in Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, which I now desperately need to see, even if I know it will be terrible. If you listen to all this without having seen the film, don't let my spoilers deter you. This is a film that demands to be watched with rapt attention. This is the best that sci-fi has to offer. I'm not as ecstatic about the retconned favorite film of Joel Robinson's, but since I had to seek it out to truly consider my research complete, let's wrap this all up by discussing George Pal's The Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe. The story is about, well, I'm not sure. And unlike The Wizard of Oz, medicinal marijuana gummy bears weren't affecting my logic centers. It was pure, stone-cold, sober confusion. On a grand scale, it's either about the majesty of God's creation or loving the earth for what it is in a godless universe. On a less grand scale, it's about a strange man who spends most of his time wearing the face of a Confucian elderly Chinese man who comes to a small town in Arizona at the dawn of the century. This old Chinese man is played by acclaimed white man Tony Randall in what is admittedly great makeup, but completely wrong dialect.
Excuse? Who are you? Name Lowe. Dr. Lowe.
Well, there ain't no bicycle around here, unless you know how to remedy this machine.
Do plinting here?
No, we sell ladies' underwear.
What's the matter, you big wise guy? All the time make joke. Make fun of bold Chinese sparrow.
Take it easy now. Take it. It's too late in the afternoon for any tent.
Who you? Who you? You boss?
No, bossy over there.
Busy?
Well, you might say.
Okay, I wait.
Then again, it could be worse. It could be Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Mr. Go right through. Someday, Mr. Go right through. What happened to you anyway? You take off for the powder room, and that's the last I see you.
Now, really, Harry?
Harry was the other guy. I'm Sid Arbuck. You like me, remember? Mr. Go right through. I protest.
Oh, darling, I am sorry, but I lost my key.
But that was 2 weeks ago. You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell. You disturb me. You must have a key made.
But we'll get to that mess much later. This fake Chinese man calls himself Dr. Lowe. He's set up a 2-night circus in the midst of the town's citizens arguing in town hall about a rich outsider who wants to buy their land for some old-timey reason. There's a definitive reason. I just forgot what it was and don't care to look it up. Through the magic of his circus, Dr. Lowe convinces the town to not give this outsider their land. Why? Because he cares about these people? Not necessarily. He arrives in town before the issue is even brought up. Does the circus have anything thematically linked to their plight? Not unless the Loch Ness Monster is involved with their plight. That's right. For some reason, the big set piece of this film centers right around
it was that goddamn Loch Ness Monster!
And not once does this damn monster ask for tree fitty. Missed opportunity. It's also inside this circus that Tony Randall plays various roles such as a snake with a human face, Pan, the god of love, Medusa, and a version of Merlin whose face makeup looks almost identical to the scared spectator animatronic in the graveyard of the Haunted Mansion. Dr. Lowe does strike up a relationship with a tow-headed young boy named Mike, get it? Whom he tries to impart some kind of useless wonder by dropping his egregious accent and saying something familiar.
Mike, let me tell you something. The whole world is a circus, if you know how to look at it. The way the sun goes down when you're tired, comes up when you want to be on the move. That's real magic. The way a leaf grows, the song of the birds, the way the desert looks at night, with the moon embracing it. Oh, my boy, that's circus enough for anyone. Every time you watch a rainbow and feel wonder in your heart, every time you pick up a handful of dust and see not the dust, but a mystery, a marvel there in your hand. Every time you stop and think, I'm alive, and being alive is fantastic. Every time such a thing happens, you're part of the circus of Dr. Lowe.
I don't understand.
Neither do
Any actual wisdom in that quote is immediately erased by the soundtrack. He also interacts with other members of the town, primarily Barbara Eden, who plays Mike's mother. I'll admit that her presence distracted me from the narrative. Every time she says a line of dialogue, I just imagine each sentence ending with,
I will teach thee, master.
At one point, she basically calls Lowe's circus tent a TARDIS.
What I can't figure out is how he managed to get so much into this tent. It seems to be bigger on the inside than it is on the outside.
Dr. Lowe is a remarkable man.
And this movie was released just 5 months after the first episode of Doctor Who was broadcast on BBC One. Coincidence? Certainly. But her character, like every other denizen of Abalone, Arizona, falls into stock cliches of the era. The lone, headstrong, yet uptight, yet righteous woman, the overbearing monster wife and her henpecked, emasculated husband, racist, moronic cowboys, the stoic and noble Indian, the scrupulous developer with a dastardly scheme, the sloppy drunk that looks at something with an unbelievable broadness and takes a swig of booze, the local bland social justice warrior, the old magic wise Chinaman. They're all here, and they're all thinly drawn. After all the crazy circus nonsense is over, and the townspeople are magically convinced that their land deal is bad, Dr. Lowe goes back off into the ether from whence he came, but not before the movie throws one more curveball. Mike goes out to the desert to look for Lowe, but instead finds 3 wooden balls. Despite not having any skills previously and lamenting that he couldn't juggle, Mike can now juggle like there's no tomorrow, and he does so while crying heavily. It is then that the other protagonists start to pontificate on the mystery of Dr. Lowe.
I wonder where he came from.
Or where he's going. Or if he was ever here at all.
I can do it. You see, Dr. Lowe, I can do it. Look, Dr. Lowe, watch me. I can do it.
Mike, the whole world is a circus if you look at it the right way. Every time you pick up a handful of dust and see not the dust, but a mystery, a marvel there in your hand. Every time you stop and think, I'm alive. And being alive is fantastic. Every time such a thing happens, Mike, you are part of the circus of Dr. Lowe.
So, is he God? Or a reminder that God's majesty is vast? Or a reminder that we don't need God because we have wonder? I swear, I'm totally sober and I have no idea. Is this a Mr. Rourke from Fantasy Island situation, where he's either God or the devil or nothing, and all answers are correct? And if he is God, why does God clearly have some issues with Chinese people? I have no clue, but the biggest question I have is more Joel Hodgson centric. How, after seeing this movie several times and being able to quote the most baffling line in it word for word, did he manage to pronounce the main character's name incorrectly? Back on MST3K, Joel Robinson manages to escape his predicament and land safely on Earth, and the Mads are now left with a satellite in space with no human test subject to show cheesy movies to. But wait, what about that temp?
Of course, I'll sign your time card, young man. In fact, I think you're going to be working for me for a long, long time. Push the button, Frank. Say, Mike, what size jumpsuit do you wear?
As I've said many times before, MST3K would never be the same. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that it became a different show. More than once, in fact. The man who gave birth to the concept was gone, and now the show would be forced to decide its future without a break between seasons to figure things out. The shows to follow would be, in my opinion, funnier, more visually ambitious, and just plain new. But that's a story for another time. Next time in particular. What was the show like hosted by Mike Nelson? How did the man and the bot's relationships change? What about the time they went to an alternate timeline, perhaps the darkest timeline? That's all in our next chapter, or maybe at most the chapter after that. Goodbye for now, Joel. Thank you for what you contributed to television canon and my life. See you soon. But this podcast isn't over yet, folks. You should know that by now, you silly goose. It's time for a very special random recommendation. This week's recommendation comes from a previous source, my good friend and a great writer, Catherine Coldiron, whose blog, The Fictator, I try to recommend as often as possible. The recommendation is more like earlier, indirect installments, as it originated from a great article on 70s self-serious science fiction. The subject, 1974's baffling odyssey Zardoz. As for why I watched it, here's Catherine herself.
This is Catherine Coldiron, and you're listening to The Coolness Chronicles. It's been my observation that although aesthetics generally were at their worst in the American 1970s, clothes, home decor, haircuts, it was an unparalleled golden era for filmmaking. In no other decade did American directors so thoroughly plumb the power of cinema. Coppola, Scorsese, Spielberg, Kubrick, Cimino, Malick, and even the disgraced Allen did most of their best work between 1970 and 1980. However, the decade's silly side is as memorable as its serious one, and some films have a high volume of both. Particularly in science fiction for some reason. A surprising number of sci-fi films from the 1970s are incredibly self-serious. They bear deep intellectual ideas but are executed with overly trendy production design and cringy scripts. Zardoz, 1974. Hijinks ensue when toxic masculinity spins out of control in a future that's half Planet of the Apes and half David Lynch. This film is so weird and so complicated in its premise that I don't even want to summarize it. I just want to urge you to see it for yourself, although I send you toward it with all possible trigger warnings. Sean Connery wears a red diaper, suspenders, and a long braid, and that is not the strangest thing there is to see in the first 5 minutes.
I could talk about a giant floating head belching guns onto throngs of British blokes wearing the same red diaper. I could mention the vacuformed naked bodies inside that giant floating head. I could talk about the dialogue.
The gun is good.
The gun is good.
The penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men, as once it was. but the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of brutals. Go forth and kill.
But none of that talking would matter. No, this is not a really elaborate deleted Monty Python sketch. This was writer-director John Borman's highly anticipated follow-up to his 1972 masterpiece Deliverance. And I guess in the 1970s, if you directed something as successful as Deliverance, studios like 20th Century Fox decided to give you unfettered permission to be Alejandro Jodorowsky. It's a type of thinking from a type of era that we won't see again until the studio system completely implodes 30 years from now. It'll be just like broadcast television. Just all I can add to Catherine's initial assessment of Zardoz is that it's a movie that clearly thinks that it's saying something world-shaking, but is gussied up in so much unruly absurdity that whatever point it's trying to make is made incomprehensible. There may be some great satirical points on organized religion in there somewhere, but it's so mired in, wow, did that really happen? A big studio paid for this? But not in a fun, beyond the Valley of the Dolls way. And although the movie was clearly conceived of and written under the influence of drugs, I can confirm that being stoned while watching, medicinally, does not enhance the experience. Or so I heard, from a friend of a friend. Not me. There may be profound truths in Zardoz, and if you can locate them and explain how they're executed successfully, I'll owe you $1. Actually, I don't. Special thanks to this hour's special guest and hopeful recurring guest, Catherine Coldiron. You can find the link to her blog, The Fictator, in the show notes. Thank you for listening. As always, I want to thank everyone involved in making MST3K for everything they've contributed to my life and to culture as a whole. Double thanks for also writing the episode guide. I also want to thank Shout Factory for all their unintentional help they provided through supplemental features. And if you want to support the artists who made this wonderful show, many episodes are available on VOD on rifftracks.com. And if you want to check out Mike, Kevin, and Bill's latest VOD, you won't be disappointed. I'm not affiliated, I just love them, and I want them to keep the content flowing. Please rate and review the show on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, or your chosen source. If you enjoy the program, share it with someone else. This is the most satisfying thing I've done with my life thus far, which is both profoundly sad and profoundly amazing. You can also check out our Facebook page and watch for updates. Now, like Dr. Lowe himself, I will vanish into the ether, making you wonder what I was ever doing here, or if I even ever existed. Like I said earlier, there's going to be a break until the next hour is posted, but I'm doing my best to make sure that it's relatively short. I will post some mini episodes in the meantime, including a new spin-off that I announced on Twitter a while back, just to keep the feed alive. Either way, stay tuned for Chapter 8 of the Chronicle of the History and Legacy of MST3K. During the break, please go to my website, www.coolnesschronicles.com, and click the email link to send questions, comments, or random recommendations. You could also send me mail directly to thecoolnesschronicles@gmail.com. If you want to be super cool, just contact me on Twitter @CoolnessPodRyan for any reason. Always the highlight of my day. Until then, do what you love, don't be a dick, and as always...
As long as a child cries out in the night or an actor can be elected president, we must continue the struggle.
No, Hillary. It is much too dangerous for you in Germany now.
Yes, go with Nick. Don't worry about us. We will hear his music on the Voice of America. We will hear it in the hearts of the people and in elevators everywhere.
And as long as we do, we know that we are not alone in our fight.
You're right, Hillary. And when we get to America...
Who knows what will be then?
Everything's gonna be fine.
Things change. People change. Hairstyles change.
Hillary, I want you to be with me.
Interest rates fluctuate. Who knows?
Don't you want to come with me? If you don't say so, say it now.
Want. Want. More than anything. Take me. Take me with you. Goodbye, chocolate mousse. I'll never forget you. Goodbye, Ducroix. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, Deja Vu. I'll always remember you. And I'll miss you most of all, Scarecrow.
I mean, goodbye. For now. The Coolness Chronicles is written, produced, and edited by Ryan Rodriguez. Executive producers are Tracy Rodriguez and Luis Rodriguez. Original music by Bildschirm. Please visit bildschirm.bandcamp.com for more information.